Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Scottish History Podcast. My name is Owen Innes and I'm going to take you on a journey through Scotland's history, piece by piece. The first part that we're going to be doing today is the Scottish Wars of Independence. This is a subject that when I first became a tour guide, I really sort of immersed myself in. So that's where I would like to start. I think it's a good place to start because the story could be a little bit familiar to those of you listening, especially if we start having any international listeners. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with the movie Braveheart, and the Scottish Wars of Independence is where that began. That was that particular time. So I'm going to start with Alexander II. Really, the Wars of Independence began a little bit later with Alexander III. But just to give you a little bit of background as to Alexander II, I think he was quite an interesting man as well. So Alexander II was one of the last of the Canmore descendants. Canmore meaning big head. He was a descendant of Malcolm III, the man that killed Macbeth and Macbeth's son Lulach to ascend to the throne in 1058. He was 16 years old when he was crowned at Scone Palace on the 5th of December in 1214. His father was William the First, or William the Lion, who had died the day before. So he died on the 4th of January. There was no time whatsoever for mourning. And Alexander II was crowned on Moot Hill, or the Hill of Belief as it's known, near Scone Palace. He was crowned upon the Stone of Destiny, or the Stone of Scone, which was the coronation throne, if you will, of Scotland. The throne being just a big block of stone. I would like to do an entire episode just on the Stone of Destiny at some point in the future, because it's history from when it was brought here, we reckon from Ireland, to where it obviously is today. But Alexander had made it his sole aim to control all of Scotland and rid his new kingdom of English overlordship once and for all. England and the King, John I, Scotland wasn't its own nation at that particular point. It was really just considered to be part of northern England. Alexander II wanted Scotland to be that independent nation, but he had to have essentially permission from the Pope to do so. He regularly asked for holy oils that were to be placed on the king's crown that would essentially mean that he was recognised by the Pope as the king of this country. So while England has this kind of overlordship, if you will, of Scotland, the Western Isles and the Northern Isles were mainly controlled by those with Viking descent. So the Norwegians, essentially, that's the easiest way to explain what's going on there. So as I mentioned, John I was King of England at the time, and Alexander, along with many of the English barons, were rather annoyed over John's demands that they should finance John's wars over in France. The barons and Alexander presented a new charter to John, known now as what we know now as the Magna Carta, where Alexander was promised the disputed northern territories of England. These territories are Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland. These today are under English rule, but throughout history these lands were claimed by the Scots. But King John largely ignored the terms or dismissed the terms of the Magna Carta almost as soon as it was signed, and very soon England descended into civil war, which led Alexander II of Scots in October 1215 to invade England. He laid siege to Norham Castle, just over the border, which is now just over the border, the other side of the the River Tweed. Over in England, he also ordered Newcastle to be destroyed, as well as Carlisle. In 1237, Alexander signed the Treaty of York. Now, this was the first time that a proper border between the two countries, England and Scotland, was now formed. This is largely unchanged to this day. Basically, the River Tweed is the borderline. Anything north of the River Tweed is Scotland. Anything below the River Tweed is England. So it became known as the land of the Scots, and again in future podcasts we will get onto the origins of the Scots. So now that point, Scotland was considered its own independent nation because there was now a border between England and Scotland. Alexander then turned his attentions to the Viking Norwegian-held Western Isles that were controlled by the Norwegians. The King of Norway at the time was Haakon IV, and Alexander was in Oban in July of 1249, ready to battle, but he died on the 8th of July 1249 on the Isle of Carrera, which can be seen on a nice clear day from Oban. He died there as Haakon was making his way from Norway, and no battle ensued. We then turn our attention to Alexander II's son, who became the new king. This was Alexander III. They were highly original with their names at times, so Alexander. We're also about to meet quite a few Margarets as well along the way, so I hope that you managed to keep up, and my explanation is decent. So Alexander III was 7 years old when he was crowned, again at the same place as his father, at Scone Palace, on top of the Stone of Destiny. He was married 3 years later at age 10 to Margaret, who was the daughter of England's King Henry III, who herself, Margaret, was 11 years of age. Many thought that this would actually form a union between the two countries, but realistically it did not. So he grows up a little bit. Aged 18, he sets out to achieve what his father had failed to achieve, and that was to regain these Western Islands from King Haakon IV. First of all, he sent envoys across to Norway, which failed. Alexander then attacks the Isle of Skye, and Haakon comes a-running with his own invasion fleet just off to the west coast of Scotland, near a place called Largs. Well, the battle itself took place in early October, but in late September 1263, the invasion fleet heading down from Norway was largely damaged, and by the time that they'd actually landed on land, the Norwegian army had no fight left in them. So when the fight, or the Battle of Largs, if you will, on the 2nd of October did eventually occur, it was really just a series of small skirmishes, nothing like your full-scale battles of Stirling-Bridge, Bannockburn, etc. Haakon did retreat back towards Norway, but he fell ill on the way. They landed his boat on the island, the mainland of Orkney in Kirkwall, and Haakon died in the Bishop's Palace there, the ruins of which are still there today, and he died towards the end of the month. With Haakon now dead, negotiations began with Alexander and Norway for the sale of the Isles, and the sale of these Western Islands was agreed, but as long as Scotland keep their hands essentially off of the islands of Orkney and even further north, Shetland. So this is really where Henry III dies, and Alexander's brother-in-law, Margaret's brother, Alexander's wife's brother, Edward, became King of England. We now find it 1266. Edward was actually on his way back from the Crusade and the defence at Acre when he became Edward I. Now he's going to kind of dip in and out of the story from basically here on in, but we now have Edward I. To some of you, you'll know him as the Longshanks. His other title maybe perhaps not a quite nice one, was the hammer of the Scots, and you'll find out why that is over the course of the next few podcasts. Now, as Alexander got older and his reign got longer, he started to become quite an unlucky man. First of all, in 1275, his wife Margaret died, but they had 3 children together, 2 sons, David, and of course they're going to have a son called Alexander, and they had a daughter who of course was named Margaret. The daughter Margaret was married to King Eric II of Norway, the new king in Norway, to kind of repair the damage that the Battle of Largs had caused and things like that. But shortly before the marriage, his son David fell ill and died. On the 9th of April in 1283, his daughter Margaret had also died during childbirth. The infant, however, did survive, and the infant was a very sick and poorly young girl who they named after her mother. So now we meet the third Margaret. To end any confusion, this Margaret is known as the Maid of Norway. And once again, just little over 8 months following the death of his daughter, the heir to the throne, Prince Alexander of Scots, died shortly after getting married himself, and they never had any time to bear any children. So Alexander's left with a little bit of a problem. The heir to the Scottish throne was now Margaret, the Maid of Norway, the young girl, the young princess of Norway. But this isn't what the people of Scotland wanted. They don't want a queen, they want a king. They want a strong king, not, as they saw it back then, as a weak female figure at the head of the country. So Alexander, in a way, was kind of forced to remarry. And he did. He married a young French princess by the name of Yolande de Dreux. His new bride was about 23 years old. Alexander was in his late 40s by this point. And as you can imagine, he was quite up for making babies with someone almost half or over, half his age. But then we have the events that happened on the 18th of March 1286. These were the events that really were the catalyst to the beginning of the Wars of Independence. Alexander was holding a council in Edinburgh Castle on this night, on the 18th of March 1286. And again, he was very up for making his babies with his new young bride. So after a few drinks and a big meal, he decides to leave Edinburgh Castle, which was his kind of main royal residence at the time. He decides to leave there and head to his wife's residence in a place called Fife, the Kingdom of Fife. To do so, he has to cross quite a dangerous and treacherous stretch of water known as the Firth of Forth. So Alexander leaves Edinburgh Castle on that night. It's blowing a hoolie outside, as we would say in Scotland. The wind was fierce. It was a major, major storm going on that night. He arrives at Queen's Ferry, South Queen's Ferry, and the ferryman agrees to take him across the water. Now, this was with a couple of Alexander's aides, so they somehow safely made it across the water. It is believed that Alexander did proclaim that God would help them safely across. And they did make it across. But very eager to go and see his young wife, Alexander jumps on his horse and rides away. His 2 aides were left behind. Once Alexander was out of their sight, Alexander was never seen again. He was found the following morning, so on the morning of the 18th of March 1286, at the bottom of what we now refer to as the King's Crag. He was found at the bottom there with a broken neck. Had he fallen? Was he pushed? There's loads of theories as to what exactly happened to Alexander on that night, but at the end of the day, we just do not know. So Scotland's king, Alexander III, was now dead. The fate of Scotland's hands now rested in the young 3-year-old Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Scotland was about to get what they didn't want, and that was a queen. So after the death of Alexander III, a parliament of nobles and churchmen was called, and allegiance was sworn by them to Margaret, and they vowed to keep Scotland safe until she could arrive from Norway to take the throne for herself. She was again only 3 years old at this time. But interestingly, Edward I of England was invited to assist in the safekeeping of Scotland, but under the proviso that Margaret, the Maid of Norway, would marry Prince Edward of England. Therefore, their children would be the first shared monarchs of both Scotland and of England. But if the marriage did take place, Prince Edward would, by law, become the true king in Scotland, because in those times, in medieval times, women, much like land, were property of the men. So things are rather peaceful for a few years, about 3 years or so. 6 years old Margaret leaves Oslo in Norway in October 1290 to head to Edinburgh. She was supposed to land at the docks in Leith. But on the way she fell very ill, and like her grandfather Haakon IV, was taken to the mainland of Orkney, where she too died in the Bishop's Palace in Kirkwall. This was due to severe seasickness. So now the Canmore line that could be traced all the way back to Kenneth MacAlpine, the first ever King of Scots, was finished. A new king must be chosen. And it's at that point that we're going to leave it for episode number 1. Episode number 2 will focus on what happens after this. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it, like it and subscribe and all that sort of thing. We're on Facebook, look for The Scottish History Podcast. On Twitter, at Scott History Pod, all one word. And at the moment on Gmail, if you want to drop me a line on there, it's scotthistorypod, all one word, at gmail.com. Many thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.